The COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, lives which have been changed by the lockdown period, and the ways in which each government of the world manages this emergency situation, which ranges from imposing quarantine measures to declaring a state of emergency, as well as the puzzling absurd ban on alcohol by a certain country. All of these might have reminded enthusiasts of literature of one particular well-known novel, La Peste, or The Plague, by Albert Camus, published in 1947. Perhaps the main reason that we think of this book is because it tells the story of a plague which infects the French Algerian city of Oran, depicting the town during the lockdown period, exposing the authorities' ineptitude and the workings of media and propaganda, as well as showcasing the moral dilemma of many characters, especially the memorable character of Dr. Bernard Rieu, who selflessly dedicates his life to the well-being of the people in Oran. But it is not my intention to discuss Albert Camus in this clip. I leave it to others. What if I tell you that there is a brilliant work of literature, a play to be precise, which was written and performed on stage 10 years, I repeat, 10 years, before the appearance of Camus' seminal book? What if I tell you that there is a play which depicts a totalitarian state ruled under a dictator called the Marshal, a state which is infected by a mysterious disease given the xenophobic name the Peking leprosy or the Sheng virus after a fictional Dr. Sheng from China, by a holier-than-thou doctor, and there will be many doctors as characters in this play, whose purpose in life is to serve the tyrant and not the people? What if I tell you that in this play, the fictional disease kills people who are 50 years of age and above? Young people are not affected and even seem to rejoice in the fact that older people are leaving this world to make room for their young selves and promising future. I'm talking about a play where the Marshal, with only one sole aim of war and world domination, although far from being a spring chick himself, cares only about the young population because the young are useful as soldiers, aka cannon fodders. I'm talking about a play which also features a memorable medical doctor by the name of Dr. Galen, named after Roman Empire's famous physician Galen of Pergamon, who not only selflessly dedicates himself to the well-being of the people, but, and this is where Dr. Galen is different from Camus' Dr. Bernard, he also tries his best to save humanity and safeguard world peace by using his specialization and knowledge of a cure to the pandemic, a cure which he alone knows and refuses to share with anyone, as a tool of protest and resistance. Can you imagine this? A doctor who alone knows the cure and uses this secret of a cure not to make loads of money, but to force the dictators of the world to say no to war. The play which I have just mentioned is titled Bila Nemoc, or in English translation, The White Disease, written by the Czech writer Karel Čapek. My name is Waritasi Ratana. I'm Associate Professor and Reader of Modernism at the Department of English, Faculty of Arts,ฬาลงกรณ์ University. Today, it is my pleasure to share with you the literary work which, at least personally, speaks to me the most during this liminal time of crisis, when we all are dangling from a cliff of what used to be the old normal, and looking down, or maybe up, that's yet to be seen, to the unknown future, or what many call the new normal. Well, either way, these terms are far from normal. This video presentation is part of a project called Pandemic Through the Perspective of the Humanities, initiated by the Comparative Literature Department, Faculty of Arts,ฬาลงกรณ์ University. In this project, Dr. Tho Sang, the project head, has asked me, along with the many invited guests, to choose a literary text which I think can make us rethink our world and worldview when faced with the pandemic. And I must add, when faced with how our government handles the pandemic.
COVID-19 situation has nothing to do with politics.
Today, My focus will be on the concept of necropolitics and civil resistance to states' policies on dealing with the pandemic, which, in the play, is judged by many to be blackmail. Dr. Gallen, saint to the poor, refuses to cure the rich unless the rich in his society work towards ending the war. Many view his terms and conditions as blackmailing, as the work of a demon, as a pandemonic resistance, which brings to fore the question of whether a doctor's pacifist will and protest should come before his Hippocratic oath to treat all patients equally without discrimination. The scenes which you see in this video are extracted from the play's film adaptation by Hugo Haas in 1937, known by its English title Skeleton on Horseback, a must-watch film. But first, I would like to talk about the writer of this eerily prophetic play, Karel Čapek. Born in the year 1890 in a village called Malé Svatoňovice in northeast Bohemia, Karel Čapek studied philosophy at Charles University in Prague. His full-time job was journalism. He worked as a journalist for Národní listy, or national newspaper, in 1917, and for Lidové noviny, or the People's newspaper, in 1921, where he contributed many articles and columns, which were widely read. But he was no ordinary journalist. Karel Čapek was a fiction writer and playwright whose oeuvre paved the way for modern science fiction. To say that he was ahead of his time is just an understatement. Being a journalist, he was also no ordinary writer and playwright, as the journalist in him propelled him to tackle difficult yet important social and political issues in his fictional works. Many of the contemporary readers may be familiar with Karel Čapek and know him from a play called RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, which was premiered in 1921. This play introduced to the world the word everyone now knows so well, robot, a word coined by Karel Čapek's elder brother Josef, from an old church Slavonic word robota, meaning servitude, forced labor, or drudgery. Robota also reflects the Central European system of serfdom, by which a tenant's rent was paid for in forced labor or service. What will happen when machines and robots stage a revolution against the human masters who exploit them, is one of the questions addressed by Karel Čapek in RUR. As a journalist and writer of SF, a term which I would like to borrow from Donna Haraway, meaning not only science fiction but also speculative fabulation, the speculative world in the White Disease, though without the anarchist androids, is nevertheless as bleak as the world in RUR. Perhaps even more so, as the playwright felt the increasing pain and hopelessness of having to witness the rise of fascism in Europe. The play was published and performed on stage in the year 1937, and this year is important. It was before the German annexation of Sudetenland and occupation of Czechoslovakia. In 1936, 1 year before The White Disease was published and performed, Karel Čapek was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. However, because of his controversial works, which boldly challenged the right-wing extremist ideology prevalent in his time, slanderous campaigns against him were organized by the right-wing press. One can say that he was robbed of the literary award and international recognition he so deserved. Karel Čapek's retaliation was, surprise, surprise, The White Disease, the political satire which gained him even more enemies among the Czech and German fascists, who openly condemned him in public meetings. Karel Čapek sank into depression, and his lungs, always weak, became inflamed. On Christmas Day of 1938, 9 months before the outbreak of the Second World War, he died of pneumonia. After the Nazi invasion of Prague, which was less than 3 months after his death, the Nazis, unaware that he had died, came to his house with a warrant for his arrest. His brother Josef, was arrested and later perished in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. The same fate would have awaited Karel had he been alive. I wish to mention Josef Čapek's fate at the concentration camp here, because concentration camp eerily appears in The White Disease as the state's final solution to the plague question. Those who have white spots on their bodies, which is the symptom of the disease, will be sent to the concentration camp to die. Bear in mind, this was written before the playwright could have any knowledge of the Nazi concentration camp. And this is where I think the concept of necropolitics comes in as well. What is necropolitics? The prefix necro, from the Greek nekros, meaning corpse, might be self-evident. Necropolitics is a politics of death. It entails the subjugation of life to the power of death. And I base this short overview on Achille Mbembe, who propounded the notion of necropolitics first in 2003 with an essay bearing the same name, and then in 2016 with a book entitled Politique de l'inimitié, translated and published in English in 2019 as Necropolitics. What Mbembe does in his work is to expand Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics to the extent of radicalizing it. So first, before I discuss necropolitics, what is biopolitics? In Foucault's Society Must Be Defended, which can be found in the last chapter of the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, we encounter the underlying implication of Foucault's notion of biopolitics, or the politics of life, which is implemented through biopolitical control, of which examples include state policies dealing with ratio of births to deaths, the rate of reproduction, the fertility of a population. We may think of pro-natalist policies in Singapore, like the baby bonus scheme, which was first introduced in 2001 to improve birth rate with cash incentives. At first glance, biopolitics seems to be the complete opposite of necropolitics. However, Mbembe argues that it is not. The positive power over life is part and parcel of death, and it can also become a deadly form of power. Pro-natalist policies can be seen as a solution to the consequence of anti-natalist policies. Pro-natalist policies can lead to the bolstering of ultra-conservative views of traditional family, which affect women more than anyone, as women were pushed to the role of the selfless nurturer, the giving tree in all kinds of toxic relationship, not to mention LGBTQI people. Many pro-natalist moral instruction and values education books for children, for example, teach young women that marriage and maternal duties are their end goals, the sole purpose of their existence even. Such biopolitics or politics of life ironically kills and thwarts women's rights, putting gender equality behind for centuries. I would only address the two key characteristics of necropolitics in relation to Karel Čapek's play. First, necropolitics draws on the confinement of certain populations in particular spaces, from concentration camps to locked down towns and cities, or even countries under the state of emergency. Drawing from Giorgio Agamben's work, Mbembe comments that slums, favelas, prisons, and refugee camps can be seen as the ways in which unwanted populations are controlled, and in many cases put in a permanent condition of living in pain. As I've mentioned earlier, concentration camp for those affected by the white disease is the best solution in the eyes of the dictator, for no one, with the exception of Dr. Galen, knows the cure to the disease. Being sent to a concentrated area full of sick people can be seen as having your death warrant signed. Mbembe wants us to ask ourselves if we are already living in that condition without being aware of it. The pandemic emergency might be a wake-up call to our reality of tyrannical state control, which slowly signs our death warrant every single day of our remaining lives. The world which Čapek creates in his play may seem the stuff of fiction, but in reality, we might be living it already. The strategy of small massacres, or death injected in small doses one day at a time, can come in the form of lack of basic social welfare, like housing and sanitation, or in the form of government policies which kill the people's bodies and reduce their value and existence in society. This pandemic should make us ask ourselves this question. Have we already, prior to COVID-19 outbreak, been living in the pandemic/pandemonic world of injustices, where rule of law is subservient only to the real-life marshals, and where our quality of life and young people's future have been robbed by the tyrants and warmongers? Second, necropolitics reflects the urge to produce death in a large scale. The obvious example is war. In the White Disease, the marshal, as his name suggests, is obsessed with war. He wages war in the name of victory and love for his people and his country. The hypocrisy lies in how he does not care about the older people who are infected with the White Disease at all until he finds himself in the same shoes. Towards the end of the play, the sick marshal agrees to Dr. Gallen's terms. He is prepared to stop the war in exchange for the cure. We can see that death of others, except himself, is what has driven the marshal to go to war. By neglecting the spread of white disease among his older citizens, since the young soldiers are not affected by the disease, the marshal hypocritically does the opposite to what he claims, which is love his people. By claiming that he wages war to protect the youth, the marshal sends the youth to war as cannon fodders. If Dr. Gallen had not stood up against the necropolitical leader by making him taste his own poison, which is the prospect of being sent to concentration camp and, most importantly, of dying horrible death, the marshal would never have agreed to world peace. The irony of biopolitics and necropolitics, the irony of state control in the name of life and love for the nation, which instead imposes death on people, reaches its peak in the play's ending, which I would like to discuss. Spoiler alert. So here goes. When the marshal agrees to Dr. Gallen's terms, and Dr. Gallen is making his way to the marshal to hear him from the white disease in exchange for peace, Dr. Gallen gets trampled to death by a fanatical mob gathering to hear the marshal's speech before the bargain can be honored. The doctor is violently attacked right after he expresses his anti-war sentiment, when he hears the mob cheer for war. And this is where I think Karel Čapek's genius lies. The pandemonic mob is shouting, "Long live the marshal! Long live the marshal!" during the killing of the pacifist and peace-loving Dr. Gallen, who happens to be the only salvation of the leader they fanatically love, and also of themselves and the world on the brink of total demise. A harrowing warning against fanaticism and right-wing ultra-nationalism. The ending of the play was written around 15 years before the publication of a book entitled The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements by American philosopher Eric Hoffer. Hoffer could have chosen to quote directly from The White Disease to illustrate the weakness, fickleness, and interchangeability in the core of fanaticism and extremist mass movements. I read, "The enemy, the indispensable devil of every mass movement, is omnipresent. He plots both outside and inside the ranks of the faithful. It is his voice that speaks through the mouth of the dissenter, and the deviationists are his stooges. If anything goes wrong within the movement, it is his doing. It is the sacred duty of the true believer to be suspicious. He must be constantly on the lookout for saboteurs, spies, and traitors." The mob in the play needs Dr. Gallen. They need to hate the doctor's dissenting voice. The mob needs to cast Dr. Gallen as the enemy to be eradicated at all cost. Ironically, by killing Dr. Gallen, the mob kills itself despite the claim that it does so to protect life and the life of the nation. To conclude this video, the circle comes to a close as I return to the title of the play in the original Czech language. The intersection between body, class, illness, power, biopolitics, and necropolitics can be seen played out in the word which makes up the title. Nemots, which means illness or disease, is composed of the negative prefix ne, meaning no, and the word mots, meaning strength, power, and even hints at the adverb form, which means much. Infirmity, poverty, and powerlessness can be seen as part and parcel of disease. So when we think about the pandemic, we must also think of the intersection between political control as well as policies which serve to inflict misery and death on the population in the name of love and life. Garo Chapek's The White Disease is a platform through which we rethink not only our lives when faced with the pandemic, but also how political decisions affect us all. If the ineptitude of the ruling regime in the time of COVID-19 pandemic does not bring out our pandemonic will to rebel against the injustices we witness, then Dr. Gallen would have really died in vain. Don't let him die in vain. Dr. Gallen is all of us. Yes, you, dear viewers. Dr. Gallen is you. Let his death be our life. Let our life be the cure to the disease of tyranny.
Pánové, když vím, to napíšete v novinách. Prosím vás, napište do novin, že ten lék nedostane žádný národ, dokud se nezaváže, že už nepovede války.